Shabbat Shalom. Today's Torah portion is Balak, and it tells the story of the attempt by Balak to hire Balaam and to get him to curse the nation of Israel. Of course, his attempt is totally foiled by God. Balaam is may have evil intentions himself, but he is a loyal prophet of God, and therefore is only going to be able to speak what God tells him to speak. And a couple of things that I wanted to point out or focus on in what Balaam actually says that I found very interesting. Remember, he makes 3 different attempts to curse the nation and ends up blessing them. The first time, we read a very interesting sentence. This is in Numbers chapter 23, verse 9. For from the top of the rocks I see him, speaking of the nation of Israel, and from the hills I view him. Lo, the people shall dwell solitary, and shall not reckon itself among the nations. We see here that Balaam is glancing at the nation of Israel from afar. He is up in the mountains of Moab. He is looking down. The nation of Israel is right now camped in the plains of Moab, so he's looking down and he can see them from above. He can see them, therefore, as an outsider, and I think that's very clearly noted here. And what does he say next in verse 10? Who has counted the dust of Jacob and the number of the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my last end be like this. Talking about, of course, Jacob being so many, has multiplied so much that it is as difficult to count them as it would be difficult to count the dust of the earth. Now this, of course, echoes very strongly a promise that God had made generations earlier. God speaks to Abraham in Genesis 13, verse 16. And this is one of a number of places where God speaks to Abraham and makes him a promise as to his children, as to the nation that will come forth from him. And he says in this verse, I will put your seed as the dust of the earth. If any man should be able to count dust of the earth, so too your seed shall be counted. In other words, here Balaam is making the very same comparison as God made to Abraham earlier, that the nation of Israel will multiply to such an extent that it will be impossible to count them, even as it is impossible to count the dust or the sand of the earth. I think here, you know what, I'll go to the next one. We have a very similar example of a similar echo that Balaam makes with something that God has spoken to Abraham. If we look in chapter 24, verse 9. And this is a later attempt on Balaam's part, again to curse, and he ends up praising the children of Israel. And he says as follows. He crouched, but he lay down as a lion, as a lioness. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he who blesses you, and cursed is he who curses you. Of course, an incredible echo of Genesis 12, verse 3. God's first speaking to Abraham makes the very first promise, telling Abraham to leave his country, leave his father's house. And what does he tell them? I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And I think essentially what is happening here, it's not just a question of Balaam and Balak trying to curse the children of Israel and God having them reverse the curse and turn it into a blessing. But God has placed into the mouth of Balaam an actual blessing that reflects promises and blessings that he already made to the children of Israel generations ago. God, therefore, is reaffirming through the mouth of a Gentile prophet the everlasting truth of the promises he made to Abraham, that the children of Israel will multiply like the sands of the earth, and that those who bless the children will be blessed, and those who curse the children of Israel will be cursed. And of course, this reflects directly to what Balaam is trying to do. God is reminding, not only giving Balaam something to say to Balak, to the world, to the children of Israel, but he is reminding Balaam that he dare not curse the children of Israel, for then he too will be cursed. Now, both of these statements come very much from God speaking to Balaam. Balaam is saying something directly from God. However, we see another sort of verse in chapter 24, verse 5. And here is at the beginning of his last speech, and he begins, well, actually in verse 4, he says, "Declaration of him that heard the sayings of God, who saw the vision of the Almighty falling, but having his eyes uncovered." Balaam now is declaring, this is what I have to say. I've heard from God, and this is what he has to say. And then he says, and I believe he says it from within himself as well. He looks out, he looks and sees the encampments of Israel, and he says, "How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, and your dwellings, O Israel." He is talking here, many commentaries have tried to understand what it is he's trying to say here. And they have noted this idea of the camp and of the tent referring specifically to family life. What is in a tent? Every family was in its own tent. And he's looking at the way the families are gathered, and as gatherings of families within the encampment. And he is looking at the people of Israel, and he is praising their family life, the way that they as a nation have come together as a group of families. And I think this also relates very closely to what we saw earlier in verse 23. Chapter 23, verse 9, where Balaam is there starting. We went to verse 10 and we talked about the dust of the earth. But look at verse 9. "For from the top of the rocks I see him." Here we have Balaam standing up on the mountains looking down. He has a perspective. He has a perspective that's as an outsider. The blessings that he has repeated, the blessings that God had given to Abraham that he has repeated, these are quotes directly from God. But yet there's an element here of his own perspective, a perspective, of course, that God is giving to him, but it's as an outsider. He's looking out at the nation of Israel. He sees their family life. He sees their encampments. But what else does he say about them? He says, "The people shall dwell solitary and shall not reckon itself among the nations." The nation of Israel, therefore, even in Balaam's mind, as an outsider, he says, I'm an outsider to this nation. This nation is an outsider to the family of nations. They do things differently. They have a different kind of family life. They have a different relationship with God. They are different. And indeed, I believe these verses, more than any other verses, have been carried by the Jewish people ever since. This is a statement to us. Many of the nations have seen us as separate, as different, more often than not, to our detriment. More often than not, they have degraded us, pushed us aside, tried to conquer us. But here Balaam looks, and from that same outsider's point of view, looks upon us and says, yes, they are outsiders, they're different, but then he goes on to say that they are blessed by God. They are going to be reflected, the blessings that God gave to Abraham, and those blessings will keep with the children of Israel for all eternity. This indeed is the destiny of the Jewish people, to stand alone, to stand separately, and to be loyal to God's word, and to live out the blessings and the promises that God gave to Abraham so many thousands of years ago, and that remain true to this very day. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.